right, thank you very much for that intro, and it's good to be here. It's a tough act to follow. A lot of great speakers this morning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 100 baggers and what I've learned doing the research on 100 baggers of the last 50 years or so, and then at the end I'll have an idea to talk about. I'll bring up Thompson Clark, who's the lead analyst helping me in the family office, and we'll go through an idea because you don't care about what I've learned, you want names, right? So first, let me talk a little bit about how this got started. So there's an investor you guys may know, Chuck Akre. He's an excellent investor. And in 2011, he gave a speech called An Investor's Odyssey. You can Google it and read it. I'd highly recommend it. He talks a little about his investing approach, and he's actually had 200 baggers to his credit. He's owned Berkshire for a long time, and the other one was American Tower. And in that speech, he talks about a book called 100 to 1 in the Stock Market, written by a guy named Thomas Phelps. And this book came out in 1972. And what Phelps did, Phelps was he was a lot of different things. He was a money manager of no particular distinction as far as I know. He worked at the Wall Street Journal for a while. He worked at Scudder, Stevens & Clark. So he had a varied career. And he wrote this book, which was a look at all the stocks that had gone up 100 to 1 from 1932 up until when he published the book. And the idea is just to see if he could find some similarities and use them in investing today. So his book is very well written. It's very folksy, very quotable. And so I read that book and I fell in love with it right away. And I started to quote it and talk about it. And finally a reader asked me, he said, you should really update it. So I thought, well, that's a good idea. So that's where my book came in, was really an update of Phelps' study. I looked at all the stocks that had returned at least 100 to 1 from 62 to 2014. And that's as far back as I could get data. I used CompuStat data, and I screened out some of the tiniest names. So, like the 12-cent junior mining stock that goes up, $3. And the idea is really just to find if there were any similarities or qualities that a lot of these stocks had that we could look for in investing today. So I got to 365 different names. So just to go a little bit through some of the outlines of what they looked like, just in very broad terms. This gives you an idea of sort of how long it took. So, most of them fell in that column there. It took between 16 and 30 years. And it's really just a math problem at this point. So this shows you the number of what rate you have to compound to get to 100 baggers, and get to 100x, and how many years it takes you to do it. So if you compound at 25% a year, it takes 21 years to get there. So it sort of gives you the outline already of the hurdle that you have to get over. It's compounding at a high rate for a very, very long time. So the main point of this chart, this shows you the top performers in the study, and the main takeaway here is just to note that there were really no industries that dominated the list. There's all kinds of businesses on here. So you have, an airline. Actually, in Ian's book, Southwest Airlines is a very good case study. You have a retailer. You have, a railroad way up there, which was surprising. But the railroads are interesting case studies too because they own so many different assets and they wound up spinning off things, and so they became tremendous creators of wealth. Kansas City Southern actually owned Janus, which helped that return quite a bit. And then normally it takes a long time, but here's some of the fastest to 100x. This is just, again, kind of an interesting list because it, again, includes a number of different businesses. NVR is a home builder, which you wouldn't normally think of a business you can make 100 to 1. Valiant is on here, and a funny story about that is that in the book, I pull out a number of these and do sort of little case studies on them. And Monster Beverage was one, Pepsi was one, Gillette, Amazon, and I thought it might be good to do Valiant because it was kind of a well-known name. This is when it was still, climbing on its way to $200. And Thompson is actually one of the analysts who was helping me work on these case studies. And I remember his call in May of 2015. He called me and says, I can't figure this out. I don't know, I don't know how they make money. And I said, well, we'll just skip it. Let's pick something else. If I was really paying attention to it, what do you mean you can't? What do you mean you can't figure it out? What do you mean? It would have been a great short idea because it subsequently collapsed, and so a good thing I didn't put that one in the book. So I'm just going to go over some of the kind of kind of distill some of the main lessons, and the first one's kind of obvious, and then I'll go through some others. So the first one is we are at the microcap conference, so let's throw the microcap space a bone. You have to start small, or it helps to start small, and Ian had a great slide where he showed a number of great companies that today are enormous, and we know are great companies that started off very small. One maybe surprising thing to point out is that at least in the 365 stocks that I pulled together for this study, they were small, but they weren't tiny. It's kind of like the median sales figure is about $170 million. That's pretty substantial business. The second lesson here is, or one of the most important lessons, is you got to hold on to them for a long time. And that may seem obvious, but I have a story to tell you that I just want to pull out some notes here because I want to get some of the details right. Although it doesn't really matter. You guys wouldn't know if I'm telling the truth or not. But as a friend of mine, who's a hedge fund manager, had bought this painting. And this illustrates so many interesting things about investing for the long term. But in 1999, he bought this painting. It's a painting by Ed Ruscha called Sunset to Pico, and he paid $150,000 for it. His wife thought he was crazy. It was by far the most he ever paid for art. But he was a hedge fund manager, decently successful. Wasn't like, broke the bank or anything. So he takes this picture and he hangs it up in his, whatever, in his living room, and he likes the painting. He leaves it there, and he hears over time that painting's probably worth more than he paid, but he doesn't think anything of it. And so finally, last year, he decides that he's going to sell it because he's getting older, and he decides he wants to pay off the mortgage on his house, and he's just thinking to do some things. So he goes to Sotheby's to get it appraised, and they tell him they think they can sell it for $1 million. So, remember, he paid $150,000. So he goes and puts it up for auction, and the way the auction works is you put up a reserve, so that you put up a number that you're not going to sell it for less than, and that number was $850,000. So the bidding starts at $500,000. He tells me the story like he's all excited, and he gets there with his wife and daughter and all dressed up, and it's like going to Derby Day or something. So they go there, and the bidding starts, and very quickly it gets to $850,000. So he, breathes a sigh of relief. He sold the painting, and the bidding keeps going. It hits $1 million, and he takes a picture of it, and says, wow, I sold a painting for $1 million. The bidding keeps going up to $1.5 million, and then the bidding starts to flag a little, and she's getting ready to hit the gavel, and someone comes in, $1.6 million, and it keeps going, $1.7 million, $1.8 million, hits $2 million, $2.1 million, $2.2 million. When she finally hits the gavel, it's $2.3 million. So he's telling me the story, and the first thing I said was, if that was a stock, you never would have held on to it that long. So when you think about it, why is that? What helped him hold this painting all this time to make that much money at the end? And I think one big reason was that he didn't have somebody coming in every day offering him a price, what they'd pay. Just imagine, like when we own stocks, we see stock price every day. Oftentimes, multiple times a day, we're checking our stock. It would be very, very hard to hold on to that painting if you had someone come in every day. Hey, I'll give you $500,000 for it. Come on, and then 2 months later, you say, no, I'm going to give you $250,000. Think how it works on your psychology, all that stuff. So, one of the big lessons of that, I think, is that you can't price your performance so much. Because it just wears on you. And in the Phelps book, the original Phelps book, he has a great, one of my favorite tables in the book is a table of Pfizer's financial results. And I think it's like sales, net income, but one of them is definitely return on equity. And it's for like a 25-year period of time. And he just says, looking at this column of numbers, is there any point where you would have sold this business? And so it starts from whatever, 19, let's say 40, whatever. And you see it's 20% ROEs, very high ROEs every year. Yeah, some a little lower, some a little higher. Sometimes sales are flat. Maybe there's a year where it went down. But just looking purely at those numbers, you would never have sold that business. But yet, and you would have had 100 times your money if you had held it. But of course, lots and lots of people sold that business. And why? Because they saw the price every day. And they read the newspapers, and you see interest rates going up and down, and wars and depressions, and cats and dogs living together, and all kinds of crazy stuff. And you would never have held on to it. But if you just followed the business, it makes it easier. So in the book, I talk about this idea. None of us are going to do this, but I just like the metaphor of it, and maybe it will help you. There's this idea called the coffee can approach. Actually, I had a reader of the book tell me that he has a coffee can now on his bookshelf to remind him of this idea. I thought that was kind of cool. But this is an old-fashioned coffee can. There was a guy named Robert Kirby who was a very famous money manager for Capital Group, and he wrote a number of famous essays. One of them was called The Coffee Can, and it was in the Journal of Portfolio Management in 1984. So the idea goes that, in the Old West, when you had valuables or something, you put it in an old coffee can and you bury it somewhere, and that's how you stored valuables. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it's an interesting story. And so he got this idea because he managed this, one of his clients, he managed this woman's account, and over time, he made buys and sells, and then years and years go by, and her husband dies, and she takes her husband's accounts and gives them to Kirby to manage. And so he gets the account, and he's amused to look at it and say it has all the stuff that he's been buying for her. He's sort of piggybacking on his ideas with one difference, which is that he never sold anything. And so, he's looking at the list, and he's like, my God, there's some of these stocks that are just huge positions, and there's one stock that's worth more than his entire account that he's managing for her now. And so he writes about, the power of the coffee can, and how, again, it's this this idea that you don't want to price your performance every day, all the time, and how much that can really affect your investment results. So another thing I'd like to say, or like to add here, is that lower multiples preferred. It's tempting when you look at these 100 baggers to think that it doesn't matter what price you pay, if something's going to go up 100-fold. But it does really matter, and a lot of these stocks started at fairly low multiples, and then over time, not only did their earnings grow over time, but so did the multiple. And there's lots of examples of this. There's one that I put in the book that Chip Maloney of Microcap Club wrote up, which is the most extreme example I've found, and so that's why I used it, which was MTY Foods, which went from trading at like 3 times earnings when nobody gave it credit for anything, and at the end of 10 years, it was trading for 27 times earnings. So even though earnings only went up something like 12-fold, it turned into a 100-bagger. So that can really provide a very nice tailwind. And there are other examples. Gillette in the 80s was one that I remember, where it was trading at something like 10 times earnings at the beginning, and then at the end is trading for 30 times earnings. And then there are examples, on the other hand, where you start off with a high multiple, and earnings grow, but your return isn't so great because the multiple went from 50 to 25. So that's an important quality to look for, although we can overdo it. And what this table just shows you really quickly is it's basic math, and you all know it, but sometimes it's helpful to see it again, which is the difference of having 2 companies, one that grows 20% a year, grows earnings 20% a year, and one that does 10, and you can see after the end of 10 years, the amount of earnings that you get with the faster grower is enormous, enormously larger. So even if you wound up paying 20 times earnings for company A, and at the end of the run you're down to 10 times earnings, you're still going to wind up probably much better than if you were with company B. So one lesson is that you have to take into account those growth rates, and you shouldn't be afraid to pay up for something that's going to grow, especially if you're pretty sure about it. This one is really important, high returns on capital. Almost all of these businesses that became 100 baggers were, at the end of the day, they were really good businesses, and they earned very high returns on their capital. And this reminds me of a Charlie Munger quote. Got to have the obligatory Munger quote, where he says that over the long term, it's much harder for you to earn much beyond what the business earns on its capital. So, it's an interesting experiment, because people say, well, do you have any 100 baggers, or they want to kind of know the stocks that might be 100 baggers. But the first step is really identifying those businesses. And I would bet that if we were to, say we had to come up with 10 names, and collectively we all had to agree, 80% of us had to agree before we put it on the board, that we could come up with a list of some very good, really good businesses. I don't know if that's the hardest part. I think the hardest part is kind of knowing when to buy them and hanging on that long. So one other thing that, and other speakers have talked about this is something that wasn't really necessary in the study. There are lots of stocks that went up 100-fold that didn't have owner-operators, or they were relatively faceless management teams. You look at Gillette. I don't know if the CEO of Gillette necessarily was, so critical. In that case, you had just such a great business model. But it did appear enough that it was important to have a face. So when you think about some of these businesses, you can think of the people involved. If I say Walmart, you think of Sam Walton. If I think Microsoft, you think Bill Gates, Apple, Steve Jobs, and you go on and on. There's often, not always, but often, a brilliant entrepreneur behind these companies. So there's a lot of other empirical evidence beyond the more anecdotal 100-bagger study. Is just, and first off, it makes intuitive sense when we think about the kind of feedback you get when you're an owner versus if you're a hired hand. And then there's a lot of additional studies. So on this slide, I have a few that I thought were interesting. There's plenty more. I'm sure you can find many more studies, but these are some that I thought were pretty good. One of them just says the historical stock performance of companies managed by world's billionaires tend to outperform. And the paper goes on to think, to put forth a number of ideas maybe why that is. Billionaires are very well connected, and they know people, and they can get things done in ways that maybe lesser mortals can't. Family-led companies is another one that's been mentioned again today. And then there's plenty of anecdotal evidence. The Outsiders, of course, you've all probably read, and Ian's book, which I read last week, which I think is also excellent, has a number of great case studies. Most of these people who ran these companies that became huge successes were owners, and they behaved like owners. An older book that I like a lot is called Silent Investor, Silent Loser. It's been out of print for a long time, but you might be able to find a used copy. It's a fun read, and Martin Sosnoff is a money manager, has been a money manager since the 60s. And he has a quote in here that you can read it, but there's a part in here that I particularly like where he says that entrepreneurial instinct equates with sizable equity ownership, which I've certainly found to be true. And when I look at companies, that's where I often start. We'll start with the proxy and see who owns what and what their incentives are. So those are a summary of some of the things that have come out of the study, and I've written about them in the book. That I think all these are important. But really, the most important thing of all is something that Chuck Cochray too has talked a lot about. So this is him quote from it. You can read it, but it's really that idea of being able to reinvest. So not only do you have to have a great business, but it has to be a business that can then take all of its profits and reinvest and earn that same return again and again and again. And that's really where you get this sort of magical flywheel effect. And then the most important lesson of all is just in looking at these stocks is I think that there are two things really. One is that it's both a roller coaster and it's also can be incredibly boring to hold onto these stocks. So first, the roller coaster part is probably one you are more, you would think of first, but just to take a couple examples, like Apple, for example, suffered 4 different 40% drops over the last 2 decades, including a 60% drop in 2008 on its way to 100x. So that's quite a challenge to be able to hold a business through those kind of drawdowns. Another favorite of mine to use is Netflix, which is a 100-bagger since 2002, and it's lost 25% of its value in a single day, 4 times. I mean, that's pretty brutal. Monster Beverage, which is a case study that I write about in the book, it was a 100-bagger in a 10-year run, but in that 10-year run, it had a drop of more than 40%, drop of more than 30%, and had several 20% plus drops. So, the defense in there is you really have to know the business, I think, and even then, it's going to test you psychologically. And then it can be very boring, so I just pulled out randomly. It was really just eyeballing the companies that are in the study. I have this vast spreadsheet, and I can just see there's lots of times where these stocks just went nowhere for pretty long stretches. So just to pick out a few, Bank of New York Mellon went sideways from 1976 to 1981 amidst a 100x run. So if you own that stock and you just held it for about 20 years, you were up 100 to 1, more than 100 to 1. But there was 5 years there where it did nothing. Texas Industries was sideways from 80 to 85. American Express was flat from 85 to 92. These are very taxing things, and I'm sure you're all investors. Most of you are investors in this room, and you can appreciate how difficult it is to hold on to a stock for that long that goes nowhere, because we're in the business and we see new ideas all the time and we get excited about things. But the lesson of 100 baggers is that you have to hold on to these things for a long time.
My question is on the 100 baggers. I've read some of your articles on that, and I love it. I think you've really highlighted a great thing, so don't take my next comment too snarky, which is 100X also a good sell sign? Because I can think of a lot of companies that hit their 100X in the 90s, Microsoft, Oracle, Pfizer, that haven't hit Cisco, that are still selling for less today than they did 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So should we sell at 100X, or should we sell at 90X or 110X? It's a real high-class problem to have.
Yeah, I think that's what they call a high-class problem, right? Do I sell at 100X or 90X? Yeah, I mean, it's almost a little bit like an analogy with earthquakes, as you know, you don't know the difference between a small earthquake and a big earthquake. Is it just a small earthquake just keeps going and becomes a big earthquake? It's really hard to tell when they're done. I don't have a good answer to that other than to say that a lot of these that went beyond 100X, if you just focus on the business, you would never have sold it. So I guess the main way I would answer that is to say to really focus on the business, not so much the price, because you can have a stock go up 100X and still be a bargain. When you're talking about in the late 90s, definitely, a lot of those stocks were outrageously priced. It would be hard to hold on to those. But I'm thinking of other stocks that I remember seeing in the study that went up 100X and were still pretty reasonably, valued. They weren't ridiculous, and you might have continued to ride it if the economics were still in place.
The Amazon people are probably happy they still held on.
Yeah, Amazon. I'm even thinking of Monster Beverage, because again, that was one that Monster Beverage was one of the ones that, went well beyond 100X, and again, the economics of that business never really changed.
Hi. I'll caveat this with the fact that if I wasn't, looking for this type of thing, I wouldn't be in the room here. But just to hear your point of view, so there are about 365 over the past 50 years or so. If you look at the past decade, there's a whole lot more private money out there that funds things much further up the growth path. So if you look at when an Amazon went public to a Google to a Facebook, it's just they're coming public later in the game. Where do you see, the number of potential public market 100 baggers going over, 20 years from now?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And I think, when you combine Phelps' study and my study, you get to cover a pretty broad 70, 80-year period of time. And there are all different points where you might say there would be more or fewer 100 baggers, but the number is of any given time, there's always a bunch. I mean, there's always multiple companies you could buy any month in any market, any time, and made 100X. True, I mean, like in 1932, there's a lot more opportunity than there was, say, in 2000, so the market has some impact. And what you're talking about is a more, a structural thing having to do with the market today. I don't really know. Maybe that's true, that it would affect the number going forward or not, but I don't know. I don't necessarily worry too much about it, again, because I don't know that I get too hung up on if it's actually going to be 100X or not. I mean, I'm just looking at companies that have these same kind of economics, and the supply is going to ebb and flow. I'm not sure I have a really good answer to tell you about, where they might be in the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's very difficult. One key problem, I think, is that before, let's say, over the last 50 years, if you take what Buffett did, a lot of what he did is basically ride very gradual disruptions. Mm-hmm. Like Walmart was a disruption to mom and pops, and so he had time to understand and being able to predict certain businesses. If you look at the last 10 years, disruption have become far more faster. Mm-hmm. What took 50 years now can take 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Getting to 100% penetration rate in the population, if it was TV, newspapers, all of that, took 50 to 100 years. Now it's like a new mobile app can get to 10 million in like 1 or 2 years.
Right.
Which also means it will disrupt somebody else. So that makes the whole thing more difficult.
Yeah, and that's empirically true.
You cannot escape dealing with technological disruption as you could, let's say, over the last 50 years. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that I agree that, and that's empirically true. There's a section in the book where I talk about the lifespan of companies, and you can see, you probably all read this elsewhere, where it's shrinking. And I think on the S&P 500 population, it's maybe down to 15 years or something like that. So that makes it harder. On the flip side, I guess you could say that the acceleration to get there is faster too. I mean, the number of companies that that have those kinds of runs these days that do it in less time. But the whole game is much more difficult. It's really difficult to think of a business that you could sit on today for 20 years that doesn't face some sort of existential threat from disruption somewhere. It's definitely true.
Okay, last question. We'll take a break then.
So, Chris, amongst the things you highlighted, what you learned, I was wondering if it's the same thing Tom Phelps learned in his study. And the second part was, what is the predictive power of these learnings? Like if he learned similar things, and if you do what people in statistics do call out-of-sample testing, they tested over a sample and then they tested the results over the sample for which from they have not drawn the conclusion. So I don't know if I'm making myself clear, which is you learn these 7-8 things, and then you apply it to a part of the sample from which you've not done the learnings, and does it still hold? So we're basically getting to what is the predictive power of these learnings.
Yeah. That's a good question. So the first part was Phelps. Yeah, I mean, I think with Phelps, the conclusions were very similar. When you think about it, there's some basic rules here with 100 baggers. So to get to 100x, you have to compound at a certain rate over a certain time to get there, and to compound at a certain rate, you have to do certain things. You have to have certain return on equity, return on invested capital, which implies certain margins, which implies certain sales growth. So some of it comes down to that, and our conclusions are similar. In his book, he talks about other things, investing abroad, and he answers some different questions than I chose to focus on. But the results between the two books is very similar. If you read them both, very similar. As far as predictive goes, some things are seemingly more predictive than others. Like the owner-operator thing is I would say is predictive, and you can look at a number of studies and see that as a class, CEOs that have 10% or more of the stock against CEOs as a class that have less than 10% of the stock, they do better. They outperform their hired guns. In the book, I talk about a couple other predictive attributes, like, for example, high gross profit margin tends to be predictive and sticky. So companies that have a 55% gross profit margin tend to keep it, whereas companies that have a more narrow gross profit margin, that doesn't persist as much. And again, this is in the data, speaking of lots of inputs, so there's always exceptions. So that's an interesting one. The gross profit, high gross profit margin is predictive. Those are two that come to mind right now. Maybe if I think of another, I'll let you know. Well, I guess we're done, but thank you very much for your attention, your time. Appreciate it.